welcome everybody. Everyone can hear me, yes? Welcome to the last session. I'm going to keep the introductions very short because I think we are behind time and also it's been a long day. So I'll get straight into the presentations. First up, we have somebody who really I don't think needs any introduction in this kind of field. He's someone I've learned an awful lot from his work over the last few years. Jonathan Calkins is he's a university professor now of operations research and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University Heinz College, and he's a member of the National Academy of Engineering. So Jonathan will be going first.
Thank you for that introduction, and hopefully we can get the slides up now. I am thrilled to be here, and when the first slide comes up, you'll see I'm going to be talking about the importance of measuring use, not just the number of users. I'm delighted about that also because it's a change. I'm almost always talking about legalization. That's been a major topic. I am happy to chat with anyone who wants about that later, but I have a much more focused agenda for this particular talk. And it is simply the following. A fundamental precept of management is you cannot manage what you cannot measure, and I'm going to argue today that prevalence is at best a weak proxy measure for what we really care about in drugs. Let me say that again. You cannot manage what you cannot measure, and prevalence is at best a weak proxy for what we care about. And that's a problem because almost all of the statistical agencies have focused on prevalence as the dominant measure. And that's what I'm going to criticize, and I'm going to suggest some additions to that. Now, if you want, you can go back to checking email and scanning the web, because I just told you the punchline and the entirety of the talk. Everything else is just going to be an attempt to back it up. This is my new style of presentation ever since the study came out last year, reporting that in the internet age, the human attention span is now shorter than that of a goldfish. Let me, before I get to this pop quiz, as John said, I'm a professor, so I ask quizzes of audiences. Mention this metaphor I used yesterday. Drug crime is not denumerable, meaning it is not something that can be counted. If for some strange reason the United Nations thought that it was incredibly important to understand the number of microphones in this room, it would be reasonable to ask how many microphones are there, and we could count to get the answer. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. But if the future of drug problems depended on trying to quantify the amount of water in this bottle, we couldn't ask how many water are in this bottle. Instead, it would be how much, because water is not denumerable. Likewise, drug problems are not denumerable. We can't count them, which makes them very different than other illegal activities. We can count burglary, we can't count drugs. We can measure things that are not denumerable. If we need to know how much is in here, we could measure it, for instance, with volume or with mass. And with water, in the way that we as human beings experience it, those two measures are almost equivalent. They're not exact, right? They're related through density, but at the temperatures and pressures that human beings inhabit, the density is always pretty close to 1 kilogram per liter. So if what we really cared about was the weight, and it was much easier to measure the volume, then measuring volume would be fine because those two measures are so tightly correlated. The problem in drugs is not only is it not denumerable, not only is it something we cannot count, but the various measures are not well correlated with each other. So it becomes essential that we measure what we care about, not just measure a proxy that's easy to gather. All right, so that's the thesis, and I'm going to illustrate that first with this little pop quiz to make sure everybody's awake in the afternoon. What proportion of the U.S. cannabis market is associated with adults who have no abuse or dependence problem and who use fewer than 10 times per month? I mean, this is a straightforward question that people interested in drug policy may want to be able to answer. It's a market segmentation question. Just the same way that Nike wants to segment the sneaker market to know how many of the customers are 25 to 35-year-old males who live in cities, we could want to understand what proportion of the market is adults with no abuse or dependence problem and who use fewer than 10 times a month, which is essentially people who use only on weekends. So what do you think the answer is? Anyone want to shout out a guess? 70. I hear 50, I hear 70. Do I hear any other guesses? So in part, I'm nasty. This is a trick question. The right answer is it depends entirely on the measure of use. If you care about the proportion of users, which is to say prevalence, that market segment is fully 1/3 of people who have used marijuana in the last year. But if what you care about is the amount consumed, and frankly, the drug supply companies care about sales volume, that's what drives their profits, whether it's illegal sales or increasingly legal sales, then the last bar on the far right is the one that counts, and that market segment accounts for only 2% of all marijuana consumption in the United States. So there's sort of 2 points here. One side point is that these adults with no real problems are irrelevant from the perspective of the companies trying to make money. But my central point for today is that the bar on the left is a lot taller than the bar on the right. Those two different measures, prevalence on the left and quantity consumed on the right, are very, very different in the answers they give to that straightforward question. The reason is simply because frequent users use so much more than do infrequent users. It's actually a quite fundamental point, and it applies also to things like alcohol and Cheerios. This graph shows 4 different measures of the market. On the far left, it's the number of people who used in the last year, and then moving over 1 to the right, it's the number of past month users. So those are 2 different measures of prevalence, the things that we usually focus on. And then the next column over is days of use, which is something that we could measure pretty easily, and I'm going to suggest that we should. And the far column is quantity consumed. Each of those columns is divided into slices based on the frequency with which people self-report using. The black at the bottom is for people who say they use every single day, and that sort of, I'm colorblind, it might be blue, I'm not sure, but that stripy thing just above the dark black, that's for what I call near daily users. They're people who say that they use 21 to 29 days within the last month. Now, if we add together those 2 bottom segments on the far left column, that's only 1 in 5 people who use marijuana. But if you slide across, that group of high-frequency users becomes more and more important. They account for 1/3 of people who have used in the last month. They account for 2/3 of all the self-reported days of use. And if we recognize that the people who use frequently also use more grams per day that they use, about 2 to 3 times as much, that's where you get 80% of the consumption coming from the 20% of the most frequent users. And that exact same set of numbers, 20%, 80%, applies for alcohol users in the United States. It's not something that is unique to illegal drugs, but it's important, and it's a limitation of prevalence. Real quick, just here's another way of slicing up the market that illustrates the importance of not focusing only on number of users. This is a pie chart that segments consumption The right-hand half is people who report enough problems with substance use to meet DSM criteria for substance use disorder. They have a medically diagnosable condition involving changes in the neural pathways in their brain. That's half of marijuana use. The red segment at the bottom is people under the age of 21 who do not have an abuse or dependence problem. A long time ago, marijuana was a young person's drug. It is no longer in the United States. You can get these sorts of insights when you look at maps like this of quantity consumed. That little skinny bar up at the top, well, that's those adults with no abuse or dependence problem using fewer than 10 times. The great majority of the rest of the use, the left side of that pie chart, is adults who use more frequently. Now, if all of these segments changed over time in proportion to each other, it maybe wouldn't be so bad that there's this tremendous skew with a small number of frequent users dominating consumption, but I want to show you that that's not true either. So here's another very straightforward question that policymakers may want to ask, and that statistical agencies like UNODC and INEHI and other statistical agencies in other countries should be able to answer. How much has use gone up since the nadir, since the minimum in 1992? It's a very straightforward question, right? Well, again, it depends on your measure. The number of users, that is people who have used within the last year, has doubled. So that's an increase, but frankly, the population of the country grew also, so this is only modestly faster than the rate of increase in the population as a whole. The increase looks larger if you looked at past month users, roughly a tripling. This is all that you would learn if you were confined to the traditional measures that we always use. And if that's all you knew, you would be missing very important information, because the quantity consumed has more than quadrupled, and the number of people who use daily or near daily has gone up 8-fold. And it is the people who use daily and near daily who are the ones who have the problems. How much has the marijuana use in the United States gone up in the last generation? It really depends on what metrics you're using, and if you're only counting prevalence, you're missing the story, because most of the increase in use with the liberalization of policy has been on what economists call the intensive margin. In simpler terms, just higher frequency of use and more use. It's not primarily about a greater number of people using, it's primarily about more intensive use. Okay, so that hopefully persuades you of my, oh, I'm sorry, I'll show you one more slide just to put this in perspective. This just compares the cannabis to alcohol in terms of daily and near daily users. Back 25 years ago, alcohol completely dominated cannabis, more than 10 times as many of those high-frequency users. Now, of course, there's still more alcohol users, but the ratio is only about 2 to 1. All right, so hopefully you now believe me that with respect to cannabis, prevalence alone is not enough. I'm going to argue, I'm going to assert that it's true for all sorts of drugs and probably for all countries. With the limited time available here, I'm just going to show you some data for other drugs in the United States. And here I can't rely on the household survey because household respondents only account for about 10% of the heroin use and 10% of the cocaine use and 10% of the methamphetamine use. So if all you've got is household surveys, you're only seeing a tiny portion of the market. The great bulk of the consumption of these quote-unquote hard drugs in the United States comes from people who are involved in the criminal justice system in one way or another. And so the best way to get at them is through a different data collection system, which in the United States is called ADAM, Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring. This not only asks questions, but it takes biological samples to assess use. For complicated reasons that are unimportant here, there's 2 waves of this, 2000 to 2003, with lots of cities and also data on females, and then a later period when there were fewer cities and it's only males. But that's a technicality that's not very important. I admit that this is an unusual sampling frame and the results are not nationally representative, but these are large numbers. We have almost 100,000 respondents describing more than 1 million days of use within the last year. So there's that going for it. This slide is the basic punchline in words, and it says, same as with cannabis. A small number of users absolutely dominate consumption. I don't want to read the words because that gets very boring. They're there if you want to see the slides after. I think it's maybe easier to see in pictures. Now, admittedly, this is a little bit of a hard picture to read, so bear with me. The horizontal axis is the proportion of these people who use daily or near daily, proportion of people who have used in the last month who are high-frequency users. The vertical axis is their proportion of the days of use. It turns out it's hard for this group to convert to grams consumed. If I could, the curve would be higher because this concentration in terms of quantity used will be even greater than in terms of days of use. And if you can see the colors of the dots, the story is basically heroin stands out with green triangles on the right-hand side because most heroin users, more than half, use daily or near daily, and they are the entire story. They're 90% of the days of use. Powder cocaine is at the other end with those yellow dots. Powder cocaine in this day and age in the United States is a little bit of a club drug thing. It's not like it used to be. So most of the users don't use daily or near daily, and the daily and near daily users are still overrepresented in consumption at half of consumption, but don't dominate it. Meth, crack, and marijuana are all clustered in between. About 1/3 use daily or near daily, and they account for about 75% of the days of use, and so presumably 90% of the weight consumed. All right, so I admit this is a complicated graph. Again, the punchline for the graph is just what I said about cannabis carries over and applies to these other substances as well. The idea that a small number of people dominate the consumption applies to all the substances, and so prevalence alone is not adequate for them. I'm going to skip that slide, it's a little bit technical. Now, to some extent, I'm asking you to accept on faith that quantity consumed is what we really care about, that health effects are driven primarily by amount consumed, not by prevalence. But I'm going to try to back that up a little bit with a few more numbers. So what I'm going to do here is introduce some additional measures. The left-hand column there is emergency department mentions. So this is our single best measure of health consequences. And then on the far right, we have things we can get from the household survey, 2 measures of prevalence, and then this days of use, which I'm going to suggest is what we ought to be using. And I also have columns there for treatment admissions and the dollar value of the market. Now, overall, these things are not well correlated with each other. So for instance, we can do scatter plots for any pair of these things. This scatter plot happens to be emergency room mentions, that measure of health outcome, and treatment. And there's a dot for each drug, and they're not tightly correlated. But if you look across all of these and say, is there any one that does a little bit better, I'm going to suggest that days of use and maybe even spending are better at making sense of things. All right, so here's a table where I'm showing you the number of emergency room mentions per something else, per user, or per day of use, or per $1 million spent. And the question is, which of these columns is sort of more orderly as a shorthand metric if you've got to simplify and focus on one metric? The first two columns are the way that we would usually think about things with prevalence, and you'll see those numbers are all over the map because different drugs are more dangerous than each other, and also because they're used with such different frequencies. LSD is at the bottom of the table, in part because LSD doesn't send people to the hospital so often, but also because very few people use LSD every day. If you move to the third column, you get a little bit more order. There are a cluster of drugs that are high and a cluster of drugs that are low. And that greater order is something we can achieve just with standard surveys by adding to them the question on how many days did you use in the last month. But what's even more striking, if you'll reach a little bit with me, is that if you denominate in terms of dollars spent or currency spent, there's even more order. So that if you had to pick one number, it's probably not best to be total number of users or even total days of use, but total amount spent. And what's striking here is I'm arguing that brings the greatest coherence to a demand side outcome. Emergency room mentions. And of course, dollars spent in the illegal markets is going to be your best single purpose measure of the criminal's income, their incentive and capacity to commit violence, and their incentive and capacity to commit corruption. All right, I should stop because smarter people will come. But just as a reminder, if you want to stop checking your email now, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And prevalence is not a good measure of the drug problem. We need to move beyond mere prevalence. And I'm making two very concrete suggestions. Number one is that we add to the survey the question on how many days in the last month did you use? No additional survey, just one more question. And I think you get a fair amount. It's not perfect, but you get a lot for one more question. And maybe an additional question that asks, how much money did you spend in the last month? And particularly if you can direct that at the high-frequency users, whether you find them in the criminal justice system or in the treatment system or any other place, that will give you, not everything, but much better information, much better understanding, and much better capacity to manage than if we continue to only measure prevalence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Next up, we have Ettore Zuccato, and he has a degree in medicine and a postdoctoral specialization in human nutrition and toxicology. He is currently lead of the Laboratory of Toxicology within the Department of Environmental Health Science, Mario Negri Institute for Pharmacological Research in Milan, Italy.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My presentation will be on wastewater analysis. Wastewater analysis is a novel approach to estimate, to measure drug consumption in the population. It is not based on classical epidemiological methods, not population surveys and so on. It's something of different, and it is based mainly on knowledge on metabolism and on excretion of the drugs in the consumers, and in analytical chemistry for the measurement of the residue of the drugs in the wastewater. The principle of the method is quite simple. We know from the pharmacology and from the toxicology that when a chemical enters in our body, generally is metabolized and is excreted with the urine or with feces. Drugs is the same, so when a consumer takes a drug, the drug is metabolized and excreted with the urine after the intake. The urine goes in the wastewater, when we speak, of course, of urban center with the sewage network, and the wastewater ends up to a so-called sewage treatment plant, which is a large basin collecting all the wastewater from a city, for instance. So we can do sampling and analysis with a mass spectrometry of the residue of the drugs in the sewage treatment plant, and we can use the load of the residues that we measure to back calculate for the amount of the drugs which has produced the residue, so the amount of the drug which has been used by the population served by the plant. So I told you that this is mainly a method which is based on analytical methods. We use mass spectrometry. Mass spectrometry is a very sensitive and specific method because you can understand that we are measuring very low amount of substances in a milieu of thousands of other substances. This is an example of what we do for cocaine. You know, cocaine in the human body is metabolized. This is a metabolism pattern. There are several metabolites, but the major one is benzoylecgonine. So we measure benzoylecgonine in wastewater, and we use the load of the benzoylecgonine to back calculate for the amount of cocaine which has been used by the population. For each drug, we can find what we call a target residue, benzoylecgonine for cocaine, 6-acetylmorphine and morphine for heroin, and for amphetamines, the parent compound, amphetamine, methamphetamine, and ecstasy. And for tetrahydrocannabinol, that carboxy metabolite. This is an example of what we really measure in the wastewater of a treatment plant. You can see loads, quite high loads of benzoylecgonine, for instance, cocaine itself, some other metabolites of cocaine, but also methamphetamine, amphetamine, ecstasy, ketamine, morphine, and the glucuronide of morphine, and the last one is this carboxy metabolite of tetrahydrocannabinol. So the load of these residues, we use the load of this residue to back calculate for the load of the parent drugs by using a correction factor, which is just the percentage of a drug dose which is excreted as a target residue. When we have the load of the parent drug, we can normalize for the population and obtain data of consumption, such consumption of the parent drug expressed in milligram per day for 1,000 inhabitants. Is what we call back calculation. So to measure the residue and back calculate for the drugs consumed by the population. This is an example of the application of the back calculation. This is a consumption of cocaine measured in the city of Milan. You can see each point is a measurement of 1 day. You can see that we have more or less a baseline of 1 kilogram of pure cocaine, which is used by the population with some peaks during the weekend. Saturday and Sunday, you can see always a peak. And not only for cocaine, this is for ecstasy, where this weekend increase is much more evident. You can see a very low consumption during the week for the ecstasy with a very huge peak during the weekend. Then you can use data like this just to have an estimation of the weekly pattern of consumption. You can see cocaine, it's confirmed this weekend peak. For amphetamine is the same, while for heroin and cannabis we have a flat consumption during the week without any increase during the weekend. So the highlight of this method, this approach, it can provide a real-time measure of drug collective consumption, so we cannot distinguish consumers. We just analyze the collective consumption in a population. And we have also qualitative and quantitative data, real-time, almost real-time, because we can have, for instance, the data of one day the day after, but not the same day. The potential application is to measure local and national consumptions, estimate spatial differences in drugs consumption, and estimate temporal differences in drugs consumption by the population. This is an example of a national consumption study which has been done in Belgium. You can see cities with a larger amount of consumption, cities with a smaller amount of consumption, and so on. Of course, consumption is normalized to the population. And you can use the data like that just to estimate the nationality of consumption. This is an example, similar example we have done in Italy. Italy, probably you know, there is a north, in the center, and the south of the country. And we studied cocaine, and you can see that we could identify geographic and demographic differences in cocaine use. For instance, we observed that cocaine is much more used in the center of Italy in comparison to the north and the south. And we also saw that cocaine is much more used in large cities in comparison to medium and small. Of course, that the consumption is normalized to the population. It's not that the large city consume much more because there are much more people living there. Important to note that the data we obtain are consistent with the prevalence data. Of course, we measure two different things because prevalence data measure prevalence of the population using cocaine, while we measure the amount of drug which is used. But you can see that with both the method, we could identify larger consumption of cocaine and cannabis as well in the other slide, in the other figure, in the centers in comparison to the north and to the south. So there is a good fit between the two different methods of estimation. We can study, I told you earlier, time trend of cocaine consumption. In this case, we published this paper in 2011. You can see that we observed that in the city of Milan, we observed constant consumption of cocaine from 2005 to 2008 with an important decrease in 2009. And we ascribed this decrease to the economic crisis. In Europe, we had an important economic crisis starting in 2008. And important to note that not only the amount of the consumption was decreased, but there was also a change in the pattern of consumption. You can see that in 2009 and 2010, the classical peak during the weekend disappeared. So not only the decrease in drug consumption, but also a change in the pattern of consumption. And the same was observed for heroin. And even in this case, it is important to note that population surveys at a local level and at a national level later on confirmed the data showing a decrease in cocaine and heroin consumption from 2008 to 2009 at the national level, and from 2007 to 2010 at the local level. This is, in this slide we can see data more recent from 2010 to 2014. We have 8 large cities in Italy, and you can see that we observed an increase in cannabis consumption in 2014, with a decrease of heroin consumption and important decrease of methamphetamine from 2010 to 2011. And even in this case, there is a consistency between the data calculated by wastewater analysis and population surveys. You can see that population surveys carried out by the Dipartimento Politiche Antidroga, so the drug policy department, observed an increase of cannabis with a decrease of opioid and amphetamine. So with a very good consistency between the two different approaches. Recently, with some partners, we established a European group performing wastewater analysis in Europe. It's a quite large group. You can see there are a lot of members. We published regularly the results of our surveys, of our monitoring, and you can see the number of publications that is quite tight at the moment. We call it the SCORE group. The SCORE group perform wastewater analysis mainly in Europe, but you can see some other points in the world, spread in the world. At the moment, there are 30 different labs which analyze 70 cities in 28 different countries for a total population on 40 million people. This is in Europe, just to see that there are a lot of points, a lot of cities in which we do sampling and analysis. Results are recently published by the European Monitoring Center of Drug and Drug Addiction, the EMCDDA website. You can see the website of the EMCDDA. The last publication is very recent. You can see that is just a few days ago. And they publish our results in this manner, showing, for instance, this is the case of cocaine, consumption, in some places small, some places medium, some places high. In this case, you can see that consumption is particularly high in the Central and Northern Europe, while in the Eastern Europe, consumption is very, very low. And interesting to note, for instance, looking at methamphetamine, we have just the contrary. We have a high amount of methamphetamine consumption in Eastern Europe, with a low amount in the Central and Northern Europe. So, or cocaine or methamphetamine. So, by wastewater analysis, we can do really a comparison of the different drugs in different countries and to have more information about the situation. Last application in the field of the so-called new psychoactive substances. They are normal drugs and we can measure them in wastewater, but they are generally in very low amount, so we need a very sophisticated method for their determination. You can see some example, for instance, ketamine use in Milan with an increase up to 2013, and methadone Methadone is not very much used in Italy, but you can see that we were able to identify the appearance of the use of methadone in some of the Italian cities by our method. This is very recent, in which we could identify in one city other catechins like pentadone and 4-mec. So in conclusion of this presentation, wastewater analysis. So wastewater analysis has some advantages. It can provide real-time estimates, give qualitative and quantitative consumption data. It can estimate local consumption with identifying spatial differences and national consumption as well. It can study time trends with temporal differences, appearance of new drugs, early identification of new drugs, and identification of new trends of consumption. And it can be used also to test the efficacy of preventive measure. Of course, like every scientific method has some limitation as well. We don't know anything about the consumers. I told you earlier that we measure consumption in the collectivity. We don't know anything about the consumer. We don't know the route of administration, the frequency of use, and so on. It's difficult to estimate the amount of the street drug consumed because we have no information on the site of the dose and the purity. And there are possibility sources of uncertainties, metabolism, back calculation, and so on. But in any case, we are sure that wastewater analysis provide data which are difficult to be obtained by population surveys. And we are sure that there is a good complementarity between wastewater analysis and epidemiological methods, because wastewater analysis measure amount of the drug which is used, but epidemiological methods give information on the prevalence of use. This is my group. Many thanks to my group of work, and thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you, Ettore. Our last speaker is a last-minute addition, I think, to this panel. It's Angela Mee, who probably also needs no introduction here. She's the Chief of Research at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, where she oversees global... You all know her, so here she goes.
We have just had the presentation early with a long... Yeah, no, not because very well known, but I don't think there's no point to repeat. The title of the section is New Metrics for Drugs. And there's been a recent discussion at international level, and particularly brought by those that want to change drug policies, in arguing for changing the metrics and trying to change the indicators so that we can more regularly see things that currently we don't see. So first of all, I would like, thank you. First of all, I think as you say in the US, you don't throw the baby with a bathwater. So in that sense, I think when we talk about new metrics, I don't think we wanted to completely delete the old metric. And so I just want to give you a flavor, maybe for those of you that are not so into drug policy and drug statistics. But what does that, in a way, the current metric is quite powerful, and there is a lot that we can still learn from the current metric. And so, for example, when we talk about markets or supply, traditionally when we talk about drugs, we distinguish between demand, so you look at the use, the health aspect, and supply, so to look at the markets that come, the drugs that come into the market. And so here is an example to make the point on how we can understand the market of the drug market means when, as we see in illicit crop to see, when this market is shrinking, is expanding, there are more people using, less people use, is more expensive, less expensive. We understand the market when we really put together all kind of information, and all kind of information includes typically the seizure, the price, the purity of the drug, and the consumption. And here is an example of the cocaine market in the United States, and then bringing, all of this, many of this information together. And you clearly see that, all of this information point to the fact that from 2006, the cocaine market in the US has shrunk. But again, you can draw this conclusion if you put all of this information together. So in a way, what I'm trying to argue is that we should not forget that even seizures, that, for those that are very much into drug policy, that focus on health and so on, I mean, it's still quite powerful, valuable information, the price as well. And so that is an example. Then another example of something that is very powerful, and we know when we produce this kind of information at the global level, is always very much, we see that law enforcement agencies, but also the media, love it. And here is to look at the flows of drugs. Here is just an example, for example, of opiates. And to see, for example, that there are three distinct markets. There is the Afghan market, where you see is really dominant, because indeed, it's like 70–80% of the production of heroin and opium. But then you have a smaller market from the Myanmar and Laos production. And then you have a market in the Americas that is predominantly from the production in Mexico and Colombia. You can see, again, why it is important to see that it's very different from cocaine, for example, flows. And you see that it's a completely different market. It's definitely all based on the production basically in three countries, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And then all the other countries in the Americas serving as a trafficking flow. And the majority of the cocaine basically goes either to the United States or to Europe. So it's important, still is a very useful information if we want to look at understand the drugs globally. Well, also in terms of health impact of the drug problem, we have the traditional metric that looks at prevalence, and you see, for example, of the number of people that have used drugs, in the previous year, so annual prevalence, that are the blue little people, and but then also to look at, and then I think what also John, express it more in quantities, but in terms of number of people, is probably what most important for drug policy are the red people that are really the one with what we call drug use disorders, so with dependence. So they are the one that really matters if we look in terms of looking for treatment. And again, data on treatment that tell us that, for example, that only 2 of those red little people have access to treatment, while all of them would need treatment. But then also to look at the harm, how many inject drugs, and as you know, injecting drugs is the most, the way of using drugs that has the most negative impact on health, and also then how many of these also are living with HIV or with hepatitis C. So these are, again, if you want to design a program for treatment, these are important information. And so, again, I don't think that they should go, throw away with bathwater. The other information, for example, is on prison, and this is just an example to look at some subpopulation. For example, continuously monitoring, even if it's only drug prevalence, but to see that in prison, is, almost 10 times more than the heroin use in the general population. Again, important information to design policy and to understand where the state should intervene. Well, but the idea of new metrics, so I want to bring as an example something that actually we have not published yet, so you're among the first to look at some of this, some information that we are actually now releasing on the 23rd of June, that is the new World Drug Report. And what we have done is analyzing the complex relationship between drugs and development. And I'm using this to show how indeed there is much more information that we need, that we would need in order to understand the drug problem. And what we have done is that we really try to look and define sustainable development into 5 areas. What is important here is basically the 4 thematic areas of social development, economic development, environmental development, and peaceful and just society. And we try to understand what is the relationship between all of these elements with drug use or drug supply. And so how much social development, for example, affect drug use and supply, and how much drug use and supply affect development. The same for the drug policy. How much the drug policy influence development, and how much development influence drug policy. Those that are, again, the debate on legalization, many have concentrated only one of that arrow, and mainly to show the negative impact of a drug policy on development. But if we want to see the whole and understanding, we really believe that we have to look at all those arrows. And so, for example, when you look at the relationship between social development and drugs, so it's clear where there is, again, links between social exclusion, stigma, and drug use. And so this brings also to the need to go beyond looking at what we have seen in prevalence and the impact of on health, but really to also measure social harm. So beyond just the health impact of drugs. And here is just an example from Brazil and one from the United States. You see, for example, from Brazil here is the living condition of regular crack users in Brazil. And you see that a large proportion of the crack user, okay, either they live on their own family or in an apartment or house, but you see that there is a very high proportion of those that live in the street. Or that, they're just in a friend's house, or they're in a temporary accommodation and so on. But really shows how here is not easy to understand what is the cause. Is it because they live in a street that they use crack, or is it because they use crack that they live in the street? But this gives an idea that, we need also to look at the social conditions of drug use and not just the health. The other one is an example on the United States in terms of unemployment. And see, the blue ones are the overall unemployment in the United States. And you see the big difference between unemployment between the mainstream population and the drug user in relation to the different type of drugs. Economic development and drugs is important to notice. And here, I think, again, this shows and makes a very important point in relation to how we also discuss drugs, and it goes also a little bit on the direction of what John was saying. You see here is, again, an example from Colombia, and here you see the use of different drugs by social class. So the blue ones are the healthier class, and the red one are the poorer class. And you see here past year use and those that are more dependent. So the one that are very heavy use, and the one that really has, again, what we call have a drug use disorder. And you see that here past year use is higher, particularly in the richer class, particularly for cannabis, for example. But you see that, and if you look, concentrate on cannabis or any drug, is not true for dependence. And this, pointed to the fact that is it the lower social class that often have the most negative impact, and that they are more likely to translate into dependence than recreational use. And it is interesting, but that is a parenthesis in relation to the legalization discussion, is that often the legalization discussion is based on the recreational use. And the idea that, people in recreational use you know, they should, that's the philosophy of legalization. Why should a system prevent recreational use? But you see that at the end, another recreational user that actually pays the most negative impact of drug use. So in a way, you know, we have to think about the poor and not only to focus on the richer sector of population. But also in terms of, again, metrics, is also to move in economic terms from I show you the drug flows in terms of quantity of flows, but also to look at the economic aspect, and particularly at the profits that organized crime makes out of the drugs. And I think Francisco earlier in the other room was saying organized crime is not married with drugs, is married with money. And so if we really want to understand and to prevent and to, you know, really fight the organized crime, we also need to understand the money aspect. And here, just to give you an example of what we have estimated in terms of, this is what we call the Balkan route, is the heroin starting from Afghanistan and going through Europe through the Balkan route. And you see here the profits that we have estimated, and you see that the biggest profits are made at the destination market. So in the richest countries, because it's always at the retail where most of the money is made. But also to look at the environment. And here is an example of that, again, we're looking at the relationship between environment and drugs. I'm just giving you really, really very small example, but there are so many linkages. But here is just to make the point on, for example, how much cultivation, illicit cultivation affect deforestation. And that, again, is something that you know, we should include if we really want to include all aspects in our metric. But also to look at drugs and violence. And this is something that you know, is very much discussed, particularly in this region. But here I want, this is an old, is relating to 2010, is old. In the World Drug Report that is about to come out in a few days, includes the newest data. But here, but making the same point, you see here, for example, for countries in Central America, the cocaine flows, so the quantity of cocaine that is transiting the different countries, mapped against the homicide rate. And you see that there is not always a clear relationship between high level of violence and drug trafficking. And I think it's important to see because, again, some of the slogans that often we hear is that, well, drugs produce violence, and then, well, not always. The violence in Central America is much more complex than just drug trafficking. So, in terms of you know, the relationship between drugs use and violence is still, we believe, under research and not properly understood. Because really we had this question and say, why? And beyond Central America, if you see the homicide rate that we have in Central America, even regional, where you have this big flows of cocaine going, you see the flows, I show you the maps of the flows earlier of, for example, opiates in Europe. You know, there are tons and tons of heroin out of Afghanistan, going through Europe or going to Russia through. But the level of homicide is much, much lower than in Central America. So what is that makes drug trafficking violent in one region and drug trafficking not violent in the other region? We have tried very, I would say, humbly to answer this question because, but and it might be, you know, it looks like it's relating to the way how the drug markets are structured, the way how the criminal organizations are structured, but also relates also to the characteristics relating to governance, criminal justice system, and so I think more really we need to understand in relation to the role of corruption, the rule of law, and the governance in defining the impact of drug trafficking. So to finish, I just have a provocative question and say, you know, in looking at all of this, really if we wanted to understand the complexity, I'm wondering if we are looking for a new metric or a new analytical framework to understand the drug problem.
Okay, thank you, Angela. I have two questions here. The first is for John from Amaya. And she asked, don't you think it's important to consider people may report more use than they did before in states where it is now legal because they aren't worrying about reporting an illegal behavior? And the second question is, can you truly compare metrics before and after regulation? It's the same question.
Yeah, on the first I have a PhD student who's looked into that, and the impact's actually been pretty small. Even before legalization, Americans were not very shy about describing cannabis use because it really just wasn't sanctioned. You know, it's sort of remarkable that 35 million Americans admit to using something that is illegal, and the vast, vast majority of them are not in the states that have legalized. So it just wasn't that stigmatized to begin with, so there wasn't much of a change. The second question was, can you compare metrics in general before and after legalization? Is that?
Can you truly compare metrics before and after regulation? It doesn't specify.
Well, you know, I think it's really important to note that it remains true that Uruguay is the only place on earth where any of the traditional illegal drugs has truly been legalized, right? The United States still has a Controlled Substances Act. We still haven't fully legalized. We're on our way there. I do think that many things just change entirely. After legalization, you're not going to have much of a black market, and you are going to have things to measure like tax revenue, and you're going to have completely new sources of information. Right? So I gave a little spiel about this at a conference last month. We will have to fundamentally rethink data collection after legalization to think like business school professors. Business school professors study consumption through things like loyalty cards. So after legalization, users will have little cards that they swipe every time they purchase so they get discounts when they buy a lot. Those loyalty cards will give far richer information than anything that we have now. The vendors who sell over the web fully legally are going to be able to do A/B testing just like Amazon.com does. That'll be richer information than we have. The vaping pens can be instrumented in an Internet of Things way so that the companies know not just how much you bought, but they know puff by puff when you used and exactly where you were when you took that puff so they can use that information to increase their sales. So yeah, after legalization, we will be in a completely different data world, and the models that we should be thinking of there are the marketing databases that the tobacco companies and the alcohol companies use now to figure out how to promote sales.
The second question is to Ettore, and it's quite brief. It's from Patricia Julnes. Can you discuss the ethical implications of wastewater analysis?
The ethical application, yes, it's an important question, particularly because wastewater analysis can be performed even in a very small community. We can perform wastewater analysis in schools, for instance, and ethical problems here are very important. So we have some guidelines about ethical issues in wastewater analysis. We published recently papers about that, and we decided to keep, of course, blind the name of the school and blind the name of the small communities and so on. So all the situation that we suspect can cause some problems, we can blind the name of the place.
Our last question is for Angela. It's quite a lengthy question, but why are you not, well, this is from Amaya again, why are you not measuring serious human rights violation, torture, murder, and forced disappearance committed by states enforcing prohibitionist drug policies? And if you were worried about exclusion and marginalization stigma, why not measure how illegality aggravates these conditions for both people who use drugs and communities who produce drugs?
Well, we don't measure it now because we don't have, there are not many states that release data on the violation, and so we are an international organization, and so we simply don't have the instrument to have, state reporting this violation. But definitely, that's the point. When we talk about a new metric, that should be part of a new metric. I think what is important for this new metric is that does not only measure either only the negative impact or only the positive impact of the policy. It just have to measure all the type of impacts. So it's indeed is a good point.
Yeah, if I could maybe make a comment on, you made the point about deforestation, and it's kind of a truism in Colombia that eradication efforts actually drove deforestation. It's that it drove producers further into the forest, they tore down twice as much forest, they planted often more crops in case that some was sprayed and some wasn't. So I think that some way needs to be incorporated into some of these evaluations as well, that policies have unintended consequences.
Indeed, and that's where when I say we look at the relationship between environment and cultivation, that's exactly the point. I mean, I just show one, and also, for example, the impact of spray. Okay, the research is not conclusive. Some say there is no impact, some say is impact, but these are something that needs to be looked at.
I've just realized that's actually another question that was sent, is the relationship between cocaine eradication and forest loss. So I think that says forest loss. So I think
that's what you said. That is also
and this is a comment for John Calkins. The same different picture comparing prevalence and intensity of drug use applies to firearm ownership in the USA. Even more so, household prevalence of firearm ownership has decreased over time. Applications for firearm permits have skyrocketed over recent years. Bottom line, firearm owners are accumulating more guns.
Yes, exactly. That makes my point. It's even more fundamental. This phenomenon of a small number of people accounting for a disproportionate amount of consumption has a name. It's named after a famous Italian economist, Mr. Pareto, who developed the law looking at land ownership. So the original application of this law was to ownership of land. A small number of people own most of the land. It applies to alcohol, it applies to marijuana, it applies to guns. It applies to breakfast cereal. It's not a particular to it being a dependence-inducing intoxicant. Now, to use your example of firearms, would you rather only know what proportion of households have a gun, full stop? Or, in deference to Angela, yes, I'm suggesting adding information, not taking any away. Would you rather know not only how many households have a firearm, but also how many firearms are out there, and what proportion of households have a lot of firearms or few? My point is that if you're asking prevalence, it's not hard to also ask intensity. Just ask number of days of use. And if you really want to make me happy, also ask how much money did you spend, instead of stopping with, have you used in the last year, have you used in the last month?
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. Do we have any more comments from the panel?
I think both, when you discuss about the weight or the general, and then for the wastewater, doesn't a lot depends the way how people use drugs, and some people get addicted or can get high with very little, and some people get high with a lot. And so how are you able to then translate for the wastewater? I guess also the metabolism of people have a different way of metabolize, I don't know. And then when you try to normalize it to individuals, doesn't this then affect? And then in relation to when you want to aggregate the quantities, isn't the quantity consumed by individuals important and difficult to measure?
For wastewater analysis, generally, we try to dominate differences in metabolism. We use literature data and we do a sort of meta-analysis of this literature. And we try to estimate if with with the user metabolism is different in relation to not users. And we try just to obtain a data which is representative of the population. Of course, this is a difficult exercise, and we are sure that we have some differences that cannot be dominated, but it's what we can do.
Angela, I think you've just given us definitive scientific proof of why you have the job you have and the respect that we have for you. It's a brilliant question. Yeah, I think we really would like to have multiple measures, and they play their complementary roles, just as the traditional measures in your picture of the decline in the cocaine market in the United States between 2006 and 2010 played complementary roles. It's absolutely true, particularly for opiates, that there are people who are dependent and use 500 per milligrams per day, and there are other people where the heroin is more expensive and or their income is lower who are averaging only 100 milligrams per day, but both meet the criteria for dependence, and both are behaviorally affected in almost the same way. So no measure is perfect. Days of use is valuable, weight is valuable, and amounts spent are valuable. But I would, in the best of all possible worlds, absolutely like to have all three of those things, because there are such differences in quantities consumed per day of use. Even for cannabis, both in the United States and in the 6, I think it was, countries in Europe where we collected the data, the daily users consume 2 to 3 times as many grams per day they use than do the people who are using infrequently.
We can wrap up there. So maybe just a final round of applause for our panelists.